There is a specific kind of silence that exists only when the front door closes and the world stays on the other side. For some, this silence is a void to be filled, a vacuum that pulls at the edges of the mind until it creates a frantic need for noise. But for others, this silence is a living thing, a gentle, expansive breath. It is the moment the social mask dissolves, not because it was heavy, but because it is no longer required. To love living alone is not an act of withdrawal, but an act of arrival. It is the quiet realization that one's own presence is enough. In a world that equates isolation with loneliness, there are those who have found a different truth, that the most profound intimacy we can experience is the one we cultivate within the four walls of a home that asks nothing of us except that we simply exist. The key turns in the lock with a sound that is less of a click and more of a punctuation mark, a definitive end to the sentence of the day. As the door swings open, there is no rush of greeting, no immediate demand for attention, and no need to adjust the expression on one's face to match the mood of another. There is only the air, still and expectant, holding the faint scent of tea, old books, or the lingering coolness of a morning left behind. For the person who loves living alone, this first step across the threshold is a physical shedding of weight. It is the moment the external world, with its jagged edges and relentless noise, finally loses its grip. In the architecture of a solo life, the hallway is more than a passage. It is a decompression chamber. Outside, the world operates on the currency of visibility. To move through a city, an office, or even a grocery store is to be constantly perceived, categorized, and reacted to. One must maintain a certain posture, a specific social frequency. But inside these four walls, the self is allowed to go soft at the edges. There is a profound, almost primal relief in the knowledge that no one is watching. The shoulders drop. The breath, which has been shallow and performative for hours, finally expands into the belly. Here, silence is not an absence of sound, but a presence of peace. It is a thick, velvet texture that wraps around the furniture, softening the light and slowing the clock. The rituals of the solo dweller are small, rhythmic, and deeply personal. They are the quiet choreographies of a life that requires no justification. There is the specific way a glass is placed on a coaster, the deliberate choice of a playlist that no one else would understand, or the decision to eat dinner in the fading light of the window rather than under the harsh glow of a lamp. In a shared home, these actions are often negotiated or explained. In a home of one's own, they are sacred. These habits are the invisible threads that weave a person into their environment. The space begins to feel like an extension of the body, a secondary skin that breathes as the inhabitant breathes. There is a unique psychological landscape to a room that has been curated for a single soul. Every object tells a story that does not need to be translated for a witness. The stack of books on the floor, the unmade bed, the single plate drying in the rack. These are not signs of disorder, but artifacts of a private freedom. In this space, the ego is allowed to rest. When we live with others, we are always, on some level, a character in their story. We are the partner, the parent, the roommate. We are defined by our relationship to the people across the table. But in the stillness of a solo home, those definitions fall away. You are not a role. You are simply a being. This stillness, however, is not a static thing. It is a dynamic state of observation. Living alone allows one to become a connoisseur of the subtle. You notice the way the sun carves a gold path across the floorboards at exactly 4:11 p.m. You hear the house settling into its foundations, a rhythmic creak that feels like a heartbeat. You become aware of the internal weather of your own mind, the rising tides of thought, and the receding waves of memory. Without the distraction of another person's presence, the dialogue with the self becomes clearer, more honest, and infinitely more poetic. It is the threshold of stillness where the journey of self-discovery truly begins, not in a far-off land, but in the quiet center of a living room. To understand why a heart seeks the quietude of a solo life, one must often look back at the landscapes of the past. Our relationship with space is rarely accidental. It is a blueprint drawn in the early years of our development. For many who find their greatest peace in living alone, the preference is not a rejection of people, but a long-awaited response to the overcrowdedness of their history. It is the fulfillment of a promise made to a younger version of themselves, a promise that one day their boundaries would be absolute. In the psychology of space, we often find that the solo dweller was once the child who sought the sanctuary of the closet, the high branch of a tree, or the hidden corner of a local library. They were the ones who felt the energetic weight of others too acutely. Perhaps they grew up in a household where privacy was a luxury, where rooms were shared, or where the emotional climate was so volatile that one had to constantly scan the horizon for storms. In such environments, the self becomes a defensive fortress. When you live in a space where your physical or emotional boundaries are frequently breached, the dream of a locked door becomes a symbol of ultimate safety. For these individuals, living alone is the first time they have truly felt they could exhale without being interrupted. There is also the parentified child, the one who grew up feeling responsible for the emotional equilibrium of the adults around them. For this person, being in the presence of another is synonymous with work. Even in moments of supposed leisure, their subconscious is busy monitoring the other person's needs, moods, and unspoken judgments. To them, the presence of another human being is a cognitive load that never quite powers down. It is only when they are entirely alone that the duty of care is suspended. The solo home becomes the only place on earth where they are not responsible for how someone else feels. The silence is not just a lack of noise, it is a lack of obligation. We must also consider the role of temperament. From a young age, some are simply wired with a more sensitive nervous system. For the highly sensitive person, HSP, the world is a sensory bombardment. A shared living space can feel like a continuation of that assault. The sound of someone else's television, the smell of their cooking, the subtle vibration of their footsteps. Over time, this constant environmental negotiation leads to a state of low-level chronic stress. Choosing to live alone is often a sophisticated form of self-regulation. It is an act of neurological hygiene. By controlling their environment, they are finally able to hear the sound of their own thoughts, which were previously drowned out by the static of cohabitation. The decision to live alone is therefore an inheritance. It is a reaction to the noise of upbringing, whether that noise was literal, emotional, or social. It is the reclamation of a territory that was once contested. When the solo dweller arranges their furniture or decides exactly where a painting should hang, they are not just decorating. They are exercising a sovereignty that was perhaps denied to them in their formative years. They are building a nest that does not echo with the needs of others, but instead resonates with the frequency of their own soul. This chapter of their life is a healing response to the chapters that came before, a quiet, steady yes to the self after a lifetime of maybe to the world. Beneath the poetic surface of a solo life lies a profound neurological shift. When a person steps into a space where they are truly alone, the brain undergoes a chemical recalibration. In the company of others, the human brain is constantly engaged in a process called social monitoring. This is an ancient, survival-based mechanism that keeps our prefrontal cortex scanning for cues. Is that person bored? Are they judgmental? Am I being too loud? Even when we are comfortable with a partner or a roommate, a small percentage of our cognitive battery is always dedicated to this invisible vigilance. But when the door closes and the last guest leaves, this monitoring system finally powers down. In the scientific community, This state is often associated with the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode. Without the social friction of another person's presence, the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, settles. The heart rate variability stabilizes, and the levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, begin to drop. For those who love living alone, this isn't just a preference, it is a physiological necessity. They are individuals whose nervous systems require a lower baseline of stimulation to function optimally. In the absence of external input, their brains begin to produce a different kind of internal harmony, allowing for deep processing that is impossible in a crowded room. This quietude facilitates a psychological phenomenon known as positive disintegration. It is the idea that to truly grow, we must occasionally pull away from the social structures that define us. When we are alone, the default mode network, DMN, of the brain takes over. This is the network responsible for self-reflection, moral reasoning, and the synthesis of our life's narrative. While social interaction is essential for human survival, solitude is essential for human individuality. It is in the silence of a solo apartment that the brain begins to stitch together the disparate pieces of the day, turning raw experience into wisdom. Furthermore, living alone allows for the mastery of attentional flow. In a shared household, the flow of one's thoughts is frequently interrupted by the needs or movements of others. A question asked from the kitchen, the sound of a door opening, a shift in the communal mood. Each interruption carries a switching cost, a cognitive tax that drains our mental energy. The solo dweller, however, can remain in a state of deep focus for hours. Whether they are reading, painting, or simply staring out the window, their attention is a continuous stream. This uninterrupted cognitive freedom leads to a sense of mastery and competence that is deeply satisfying to the human psyche. Psychologically, there is also the concept of the self-determined environment. When every sensory input, the temperature of the room, the brightness of the light, the texture of the fabrics, is chosen by the inhabitant, the environment becomes a form of externalized emotional regulation. The room acts as a physical extension of the occupant's internal state. If the mind is cluttered, the room can be cleaned. If the heart is cold, the space can be warmed. This total agency over one's surroundings creates a sense of psychological safety that allows the mind to explore its more vulnerable, creative, and complex layers. To love living alone is to give the brain the gift of its own undistracted company. While the solo life is a sanctuary, it is a sanctuary built on a delicate edge. Even for those who cherish their independence, the silence of a home can sometimes shift from a velvet embrace into a cold, heavy weight. To love living alone is to engage in a constant, quiet negotiation with the shadow. In the absence of another person's gaze, there is no one to witness the small triumphs or the slow decays of a Tuesday afternoon. This lack of a witness can create a subtle, creeping, existential vertigo, a feeling that if no one sees us eating our dinner or folding our laundry, do those moments truly exist? Society, too, casts a long shadow over the solo dweller. We live in a world built for pairs. From grocery store portions to the tax codes of nations, the couple is the fundamental unit of human value. To exist outside of this unit is to walk against the wind. There is a specific kind of internal friction that arises when the solo dweller encounters the pity of the world. It is the "are you sure" from a well-meaning relative or the way a waiter looks at a table for one. These external judgments can eventually leak into the interior. On a rainy Sunday, when the walls seem to move slightly closer, the solo inhabitant might find themselves wondering, am I choosing this because I am strong, or am I hiding because I am broken? This is the chapter of the monsters under the bed. When there is no one else to talk to, The internal dialogue can become dangerously loud. The mind, left to its own devices, can become a hall of mirrors. In a shared home, a partner's presence acts as a grounding wire. A simple, "How was your day?" can pull a person out of a spiraling thought pattern. But for the person who lives alone, there is no external anchor. They must be their own grounding wire. They must learn to recognize when their introspection has crossed the line into rumination. The risk of the solo life is not loneliness, but a loss of perspective, a slow drift away from the shared reality of the tribe. There is also the quiet terror of the physical. The sudden flu that makes the walk to the kitchen feel like a mountain climb. The heavy furniture that needs moving. The strange noise in the attic at 3 a.m. In these moments, the independence that felt like a crown during the day can feel like a burden at night. There is a realization that your safety is entirely in your own hands. This responsibility is a weight that never quite leaves the shoulders. It creates a hypervigilance that can make the solo dweller feel perpetually on guard, as if they are the sole sentry of a fortress that must never fall. Resistance also manifests as a fear of becoming unreachable. There is a legitimate concern that by curating a world so perfectly suited to one's own whims, one might lose the muscle memory of compromise. The solo dweller often worries that they are becoming too set in their ways, that the architecture of one is becoming so rigid that no one else could ever fit inside it. They may find themselves retreating further and further, declining invitations because the energy required to bridge the gap between their silent world and the noisy world feels too expensive. This is the shadow of the unseen, the possibility that in finding oneself, one might accidentally lose the world. There comes a moment in the life of the solo dweller where the walls cease to be boundaries and begin to function as a mirror. This is the turning point, the subtle shift from staying alone to living alone. In the earlier stages, solitude might be used as a recovery room, a place to heal from the exhaustion of the world. But as time stretches on, the space begins to demand a different kind of engagement. Without the distraction of another person's personality to react to, the inhabitant is forced into a radical, unavoidable confrontation with themselves. There is no one to perform for, and more importantly, there is no one to blame for the atmosphere of the room. In a shared life, we often externalize our discomfort. If the house feels tense, we assume it is the other person's mood. If we are bored, we look to them for entertainment. But when you live alone, you are the sole architect of the energy in the room. If the silence feels heavy, it is your own heaviness you are feeling. If the space feels vibrant, it is your own vitality. This realization is both terrifying and liberating. It is the moment the solo dweller stops running from the quiet and starts listening to what it is trying to say. They realize that the loneliness they feared was often just the sound of their own unmet needs calling for attention. This chapter of the journey is marked by a peculiar kind of honesty. You begin to see your own patterns with a clarity that is impossible in a crowd. You notice the way you avoid certain corners of the apartment when you are sad, or how you over-caffeinate to fill a morning void. You see your own laziness, your own brilliance, and your own eccentricities without the softening filter of a witness. This is the mirror in the room, the reflection of the raw, unedited self. For many, this is the point where they either flee back into the arms of others to avoid the sight, or they lean in, deciding to finally become acquainted with the stranger who shares their skin. The turning point is often found in the reclamation of joy. It is the realization that a special occasion does not require an audience. The solo dweller begins to set the table with the good linens just for themselves. They cook a complex 3-course meal, not because they are entertaining, but because they are worth the effort of the craft. This is a profound psychological victory. It is the decoupling of self-worth from social validation. They learn that the light of their own attention is enough to make a moment significant. The home stops being a place of waiting and becomes a place of arrival. Finally, this realization leads to the understanding that solitude is a skill, not a sentence. The inhabitant discovers that they are not a loner by deficit, but a solitary by design. They recognize that their need for space is not a flaw in their ability to love, but a prerequisite for it. By learning to navigate the interior landscape of their own home, they are learning to navigate the interior landscape of their own soul. The mirror no longer shows a person who is alone. It shows a person who is whole. They find that the silence they once tried to fill is actually a fertile ground where their truest intentions can finally take root and grow, unobserved and unhindered. The paradox of the solo life is that it often leads to a more profound, more authentic connection with the world outside. When one's home is a fortified sanctuary, the act of leaving it becomes an intentional choice rather than a habitual escape. This chapter explores the healing phase of the solo journey, where the inhabitant moves from a state of defensive isolation to a state of integrated autonomy. They discover that by mastering the art of being alone, they have inadvertently mastered the art of being with others. Because they no longer need people to fill a void or distract them from their own minds, they are finally free to want people for who they truly are. This is the birth of the selective soul. For the person who loves living alone, social energy is viewed as a precious currency. They are no longer willing to spend it on hollow interactions or the superficial noise of obligatory gatherings. Instead, they seek out connections that resonate at the same frequency as their quiet home. When they enter a room, they do so with a full tank. Because they have spent the previous hours or days in deep self-regulation, they possess a rare kind of presence. They listen more deeply because they are not mentally rehearsing their next social move. They are less reactive to the moods of others because their own internal emotional baseline is so securely anchored in their private stillness. In this stage of integration, the solo dweller begins to redefine what intimacy looks like. They realize that you do not have to share a roof with someone to share a life. They often become the friends who provide the most stable ground, the ones who can sit in a comfortable silence during a walk, or the ones who offer a perspective that hasn't been diluted by the consensus of a household. Their relationships are characterized by a low clinging but high quality bond. There is a beautiful, healthy distance in their connections, a gap that allows both people to breathe and grow. They have learned that the best way to love someone is from a place of wholeness, not from a place of hunger. Integration also manifests in the way they invite others into their space. When a solo dweller opens their door to a guest, it is a profound gesture of trust. They are inviting someone into their inner sanctum, into the very mirror of their soul. This hospitality is different from the communal living of families. It is an offering of a curated peace. The guest feels the weight of the silence that usually lives there and, in turn, often finds themselves softening. The solo home becomes a lighthouse for others, a place where friends come to be reminded of what it looks like to be still. Ultimately, this chapter is about the end of running. The inhabitant no longer runs from society into their home, and they no longer run from their home into society. The door is no longer a shield, but a valve. They have found the rhythm of the inhale, solitude, and the exhale, connection. They understand that their life is not a binary choice between being alone or being together, but a beautiful, oscillating dance between the two. They have integrated the silence of their living room into the noise of the streets, carrying a piece of that threshold stillness with them wherever they go. They are alone, yes, but they have never been more connected. In the final reckoning, the journey of the solo dweller is not a story of four walls, but a story of the horizon within. As the sun sets on another day, casting long, familiar shadows across a room that knows every secret of its inhabitant, a quiet realization settles like dust in a beam of light. To love living alone is to have discovered a hidden geography, an infinite interior that remains undisturbed by the changing winds of the world. The home has ceased to be a mere physical location and has become a state of grace. It is the place where the search for enough finally ends, because the inhabitant has become enough for themselves. This poetic closure is found in the simple, uncelebrated moments of the night. It is the grace of the single candle burning on the table, the weight of a blanket that feels like a chosen embrace, and the profound dignity of being the only one who knows how the day truly felt. There is a specific bravery in this. To live alone is to stand at the helm of one's own life, navigating the vastness of human experience without the constant hand-holding of a companion. It is a testament to the strength of the human spirit to find not just survival, but genuine joy in its own company. The solo dweller has learned that the most important conversation they will ever have is the one that happens in the silence between heartbeats. As we look at the house from the outside, a single window glowing in the dark, we see a person who has mastered the art of belonging. They do not belong to a partner, a role, or a social expectation. They belong to the present moment. They have transformed the fear of being left alone into the luxury of being left to oneself. This shift in perspective is the ultimate healing. It is the understanding that solitude is not a lack of people, but a wealth of space. It is the fertile soil in which the soul can stretch its limbs without bumping into the expectations of others. In this space, the past is forgiven, the future is met with a steady gaze, and the present is held with a gentle, open hand. The architecture of solitude, then, is a temple of the mundane made sacred. The way the tea steam rises, the way the bed holds the imprint of a single body, the way the silence hums with the frequency of contentment. These are the small miracles of a solo life. The world may continue its frantic pace, its loud demands for attention, and its insistence that we are only half people until we find another. But the solo dweller knows better. They know that wholeness is not found in the addition of another person, but in the subtraction of the noise that prevents us from seeing ourselves. We leave the solo dweller here in the soft glow of their own making. They are not waiting for life to begin. They are living it in its purest, most distilled form. They have found the secret that many spend a lifetime searching for, that the house of the soul is always open, and that we are all, ultimately, our own most reliable home. To love living alone is to be finally, irrevocably, at peace with the person you were always meant to be. The silence is no longer an empty room. It is a full heart.